in its nature, accessibility services at UFV and at other institutions and workplaces is in some ways a response to addressing systemic barriers that are creating access issues for individuals with disabilities and everyone really, right? And so in terms of, this Know Your Rights series, and part of the reason I'm here too is that it's important for students to be aware of the services that currently exist at this point in time that can help them to support the right to equitable and accessible education.
Hi everyone, we're back with Know Your Rights. Today we're welcoming Rebecca and Moninder to discuss accessibility for students on campus. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.
So Rebecca, can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your position on campus?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Rebecca, and I am the acting manager of the Center for Accessibility Services at UFV.
Great. And Moninder, do you want to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Moninder Grewal. I'm a global development student here at UFV. I'm also a board member for the student union and also an elected Senate member for UFV. And I'm also a student who has learning disability and is registered with CAST, the Center of Accessibility Services.
Thank you for talking with me today. So Rebecca, can you tell us about the Center for Accessibility Services and why it exists at UFV?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Center for Accessibility Services, or like Moninder mentioned, CAS for short is what we tend to call ourselves, is a part of the Student Affairs Department, and it represents an aspect of UFV's commitment to enhancing and facilitating the support of students with disabilities at UFV. So for the purpose of our center, the term disability covers a broad range and degree of conditions that can be permanent, temporary, episodic, or even suspected. This can include like mental illness, learning disabilities, chronic medical conditions, physical disabilities, and way more. And probably anyone having experiences related to a disability that is impacting their ability to fully participate or engage in their education is someone who would receive supports from our offices. And so overall, our department is an aspect of UFV's commitment to creating a diverse and inclusive campus, as well as generally ensuring that we as a university are complying with our duty to provide reasonable academic accommodations, particularly in accordance with Policy 93, which talks about accommodation of students with disabilities.
Oh, well, thank you. And what kinds of services and accommodations does CAS help with?
Yeah, so our focus is on providing academic accommodations and supports that really help to promote overall student access and success as much as possible. And so we are responsible for primarily reviewing medical documentation that is provided by the student that outlines the impact of a student's disability and basically collaborating with the student to develop an accommodation plan that suits them. And so we can support with academic accommodation planning, applying for disability-related funding and technology, and communicating with instructors about academic accommodations, as well as just providing referrals to UFV and community resources.
Okay. And Moninder, what has been your experience with CAS and registering?
Thank you for the question. So my experience was, I didn't know about CAST when I was going to university. Luckily, I had a high school teacher, and he got me registered with CAST. And the process was like I had to bring my psych ed report, and then from there was an accommodation plan was made. And then, from there, we stayed in contact with my advisor at CAST. So I got reader scribes or time and a half at school and other accommodations as well.
That's good. I'm glad CAST was able to support you in that way. I guess Moninder just touched on that, but how does CAST support students with learning disabilities and non-visible disabilities?
Yeah, so I thank you for asking this question. The word disability often can mean different things to different people. And often we as a society too often look around a room, and because we don't see anyone with a disability, we assume there isn't anyone with a disability. And this is just untrue. There are individuals who experience chronic pain, chronic medical conditions, learning disabilities, who are hard of hearing, who experience mental illness, and so much more that we just aren't often aware of. And so CAS is available to support both students with visible and invisible disabilities, and the accommodation accommodation plan that is developed with their accessibility advisor is individualized based on what that student needs. And so examples of academic accommodations, similar to what Moninder mentioned, are things like textbooks in alternate format or accessible versions like accessible PDFs or e-texts, additional time for exams and quizzes, a distraction-reduced space, reader scribes, in-class note-taking supports, interpreters, and the list kind of goes on.
That's great. Yeah. And Moninder, what do you think are kind of some ways we can be inclusive of students with non-visible disabilities on campus?
Probably like if someone says like they have a learning disability, take it at face value, because a lot of people assume like, oh, it's a non-disability. It's like like you can't see it. It's like, all right, he or she is fine, but that's not the case. And I think there's statistics that most disabilities are non-visual.
Yeah, thank you for that. And how does CAS support students' mental health?
Yeah, this may come as a surprise to some, but the number one disability category that CAS supports is mental health. And so many students access our supports to help relieve some of the pressure and stresses that just come with being a university student, in addition to the challenges they're experiencing with things like concentration, brain fog, fatigue, and anxiety associated with their mental health, right? And so common supports for students that experiencing challenges related to their mental health are similar to what was listed earlier, like additional time for exams or note-taking supports, or even alt format materials so that students can listen to their textbooks. It can help them focus and concentrate on their material, because sometimes there's just a lot of stuff to get through. So yeah.
That's good. It's good to hear that there are supports for students with those needs.
Absolutely.
And how do students with accessibility needs register with CAS?
Yeah, so students can register with CAS by going to ufv.ca/accessibility/register for support and filling out what we call our pre-intake form. And so once students fill out this online form, a CAS representative calls them within 48 hours or emails them to try and set up an appointment with an accessibility advisor so that they can do an intake and we can get to know them and, why they've reached out to us and how we can support them. And so at the intake appointment, an accessibility advisor will ask about the student's unique experiences that may be impacting their education and review any maybe supporting documentation that they brought along with them that helps to describe what they may be experiencing. And so we tend to encourage students to reach out as soon as possible because, it can take time to set up supports depending on what the student's individual needs are before classes start. But of course, students are welcome to come see us anytime.
Cool, thank you. And Moninder, would you like to share your perspective and experience with that?
Yeah, for sure. So like I mentioned in the previous question, it was like I came in with my high school teacher and I brought my second report. But also when you apply at UFV, there's a question that comes up if you have like a registered disability or need accommodations, and you select yes to that, and someone from CAS will like reach out to you. And it's very important to have your documents, as much documents you have, so they can support you better. So they can support you better on your accessibility needs as well. And you guys you have accessibility plan, and they'll help you as much as they can.
Yeah.
Great.
I do want to be clear too, if I can add something, is that accessibility services is by no means the be-all end-all of in terms of addressing and supporting the rights of students to access equitable education. In its nature, accessibility services at UFV and at other institutions and workplaces is in some ways a response to addressing systemic barriers that are creating access issues for individuals with disabilities and everyone really, right? And so in terms of, this Know Your Rights series, and part of the reason I'm here too is that it's important for students to be aware of the services that currently exist at this point in time that can help them to support the right to equitable and accessible education for them. Yeah.
I would like to touch on that as well. Yeah. There's a lot of students who don't know there's a Center of Accessibility at UFV, and also a lot of students don't know that six credit courses count as full-time students register with CAS. So
that's a good point, Moninder.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I know there's new provincial legislation surrounding accessibility in institutions. How will this new Accessible BC Act impact UFV?
Yeah, so the Accessible BC Act is intended to make BC an inclusive place for people with disabilities, right? And it will impact organizations like UFV. So the laws will address barriers that can prevent people with disabilities from accessing services like education, which currently exist, like I mentioned, the systemic barriers that we're still trying to address, right? And so currently, a government committee, which must include people with disabilities, as well as Indigenous peoples, as well as like other populations and organizations, is working on developing the standards that will be a part of the Accessible BC Act. So in BC, up to this point, the Human Rights Code has been what has guided our accessibility supports and practices. And the Accessible BC Act is going to provide more specific guidance and language and laws around accessibility in BC and what's expected of these service providers. And so earlier in 2022, the government released their first regulation under the Act, the Accessible BC Regulation, which identified the public sectors that will have to comply with the Act's requirements. And this included universities and colleges, and so it will impact UFV. And although the Act currently has a limited scope, the government is implementing the Act in a phased approach. And this means that the requirements will come out gradually over time, which is why you're not necessarily seeing the impact right now. So as of October 2022, so right now, the only requirements are that we establish an accessibility committee that will work to develop an accessibility plan and establish a process for receiving public feedback on accessibility over the next year. And so that's what's currently being worked on. And otherwise, I know our team and a lot of the individuals that work in student affairs are really looking forward to being a part of the positive systemic changes that we are hoping will come as more and more requirements come out from this Act. Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah.
And Moninder, from what you know about the Act and what you've heard, how do you think that'll affect the student experience?
So what I think the Act will do is like there'll be more guidance, as Rebecca mentioned. Because like previously, like what constitutes like a barrier, or like what constitutes like a person not getting access to the proper care they need. So that was like a big like gray space there before the Act came in. So I'm hoping the Act will come in and brings more like guidance to businesses, to universities, and to other organizations what to do in case there's this person who has a disability. What can we do to better support them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So those are all the questions I have for you folks today. Are there any final thoughts?
So the goal of this video is to bring awareness to the accessibility services that are available to students, and also like one of the goals is like helping those students in the transitional periods from transitions to university and transition out of university into workplaces.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rebecca and Moninder. If you want to check out more Know Your Rights sessions, check out our website for more.